My name's Andy Spurka. I'm with the Ventura County Resource Conservation District. We are the managers of the Ventura River Watershed Council. This is my colleague Jamie Whitford over here. So we'll be assisting with the meeting today. This is probably going to be the only time you're going to hear me or Jamie talking until the end. But yeah, I just want to welcome and kick it off. So I'm just going to introduce now Glenn Shepard, Director of Watershed Protection District, and hand it off.
Thank you, Andy. Welcome, everybody. I'd like to recognize from the County of Ventura, Supervisor Bennett's office, Steve Offerman and Brian Brennan. And I see many other board members from various agencies, groundwater sustainability agencies, and other stakeholders, invited guests, some that have to be here. And more importantly, the show that we have on for tonight is to talk about the Matilija Dam eco-restoration project, if you will. But really, in the end, it's the dam removal project, right? And so that's the exciting part. But unfortunately, this long journey that many of you have been hearing about for so many years will continue to be another series of years to get there. But it's making progress and, in the end, building momentum to get over really the financial hurdles of getting a solution adopted and over the edge. So you're going to hear from the panel of experts. I'll tell you that they've already had a session this afternoon. It went from 1 o'clock to 4:30, thereabouts. So they're well-oiled to present to you. They've been fed, so they have new, renewed energy to bring to you. The series of briefs here is detailed, so I've asked that they proceed quickly with some pace through that detail, and hopefully you can ask questions at the end as we go through a series of briefs about the projects and the condition of the organization, stakeholder involvement, partners, and the financial components that lie before us with getting to the end of removing the dam. Back to the theme of making progress and building momentum. You're probably all familiar with the water bond that didn't pass. That had an $80 million line item in it that would have really helped towards building momentum. So it took a little bit of gas out of our team, stakeholder, project leads, momentum. But there's new efforts proceeding along at the state level that may get us back to a bond level measure. So with that, I'll turn it over to Peter Shade and Paul Jenkin to get us going, and I'll come back at the end.
I think you start, yeah. All right. I'm not afraid to talk about this subject. How many of you have heard me talk about Matilija Dam before? Thank you, Glenn, wherever Glenn went. So I'm going to run through this fairly quickly so that we don't take all night. There's a lot of detail in the presentation. As Glenn said, we were in a meeting all afternoon. Actually, I started at 10 this morning. So if I'm not making sense, just yell at me. In this first section here, we're going to talk about the history of the dam and some of the studies that have been undertaken. This is the dam as constructed in 1948. You can see that it actually always had a spillway on the top and always overflowed and was run of the river during high storm events. Before the dam, Matilija Creek upstream looked something like this. Obviously, you've all heard stories of the steelhead in the Ventura River, but also a lot of people came up to this site here. Overhanging Rock, or Hanging Rock, was just right above the dam site, and that's a postcard from 1920s sometime. So the dam was constructed. Is this me or? What's that? What? Oh, no, seems like the volume's going up and down. I'm trying to keep myself. So the dam was constructed starting in 1947 for a cost of around $4 million at that time. There's some really interesting photos in the Watershed Protection District's archives. And this was the first project. This was the project that actually founded the Watershed Protection District at the time. The flood control, Ventura County Flood Control District. Is there anything specific I should point out? You can see that the way these dams are constructed, they form it up and they pour a layer or a lift at a time, and each of those lifts I think is about 7 feet or so on Matilija Dam. Lots and lots of concrete went in. This is what it looked like when it was finally constructed and the reservoir started to fill up. I think it actually took about 4 or 5 years for the reservoir to fill. It was 1954 before it filled up. But it was only a couple of 15 years or so before it became evident that there was a chemical reaction in the concrete. And this alkali silica reaction is actually something that was really common throughout the United States, throughout the world, and bridges failed and stuff because of this. The story that I heard about this is that the contractor was actually supposed to go over to the San Gabriel River to get some nice granitic neutral sediments, and instead went over here to the Santa Clara River, and our sediments here are very alkali. So that ended up created this alkali silica reaction, which compromises the strength of the dam. So in 1965, the dam was notched down. We call that notch. It just lowered the level of the dam by about 35 feet. And you can see that middle section that's yellow there was taken out in 1965, and then in the 70s they came back and cut those stair-step things that we see on the dam today. The original storage capacity of Matilija Reservoir was about 7,000 acre-feet, and there was a county park back there. There was boat rentals and fishing and campground and some recreation. But in comparison with Lake Casitas that was constructed about a decade later, anybody know the capacity of Lake Casitas? 256,000 acre-feet. So you can see that Matilija was always sort of a drop in the bucket as far as water supply. But at the time, it was intended to divert water, store water that could then go through a pipeline over to the Ojai Valley and go into the Ojai Valley spreading grounds to help recharge the aquifer during the dry season. Over the years after the notching and after fires and floods, the reservoir filled up with sediment. This is the fate of every dam and every reservoir on the planet. Rivers move sediment, and ultimately the reservoirs will lose their capacity and fill up with sediment. So this is something that I've actually traveled to Japan and saw giant reservoirs there where they were actually trucking sediment out constantly 24 hours a day. And they were actually building a new island down in Yokohama Bay with all this sediment. Japanese can drive a lot of trucks around, move a lot of sediment and concrete. But the picture on the left there, this dates all the way back to 2003, I think. It was during feasibility. And that's what the reservoir looked like when it was drained at that time. You can see how little capacity there actually is and how much sediment there is behind there. And, the reason I got involved with this was through Surfrider Foundation. The beach erosion problems at the mouth of the Ventura River led us to really start to look at what the root causes of that were. Now, construction of the bike path right on the beach was a problem. And we've solved that, or we're in the process of solving that through the Managed Shoreline Retreat project that's happening out there by the fairgrounds. But at the end of the day, starvation of the river and starvation of sediment supplies were something that became a concern to us, and we saw an opportunity in the removal of Matilija Dam. But at the same time, there were people who had been talking about this for decades. Many of you might be aware, this was a man named Ed Hinkey who had grown up in Ventura and had moved away, but he was writing. I mean, anybody who got letters from Ed Hinkey knows he wrote letters and wrote letters and wrote letters, and he wrote letters to the governor's office and the state congressional representatives talking about how this dam needed to be removed, because by the 70s it was already virtually obsolete in terms of water supply. Our campaign, you know, I always say every good campaign starts with a bumper sticker. So at Surfrider, we had these stickers: give a dam, free the sand, grow the beach. That was interesting to try and convey the meaning of that to the Japanese when I was there. So we formed the Matilija Coalition really to try and bring together the advocacy and the non-government organizations in support of this project. And over the years, the coalition has evolved and changed. Different people have been active over the years. And I think that, you know, in the last couple of years, we've had a lot of new energy come into the project. David Yardis here, you will hear from shortly, has been responsible for really advancing the project in the last couple of years. Hans really took over when we had an opportunity to kind of regroup and look at trying to figure out how to get money into the project. There's been a lot of work going on in the last 4 or 5 years. So in 1997, the steelhead trout was listed as endangered, and that became another pressing issue that we were trying to address with the removal of the dam. And it's interesting to note the map of the watershed there. The entire Matilija Creek watershed really represents probably about half of the historic headwaters habitat for our native steelhead, where at one point we had 4,000 or 5,000 sea-run steelhead coming out of the ocean all the way up into Matilija Canyon, up in the upper reaches of the river. And for those of you who don't know, the steelhead is basically a rainbow trout that goes to the ocean, just like a salmon. Gets much bigger, and we can have a good 2-foot long fish can return from the ocean. And this is the problem. The reason that they're endangered is because of these barriers to their migration, their barriers to their headwater habitat, and that year-round flows up in the top of the watershed. But anybody who's heard me talk about this more recently knows that this is also a bigger issue nationwide. And the New York Times published this article last year, and you can see all those dots on the map. There's thousands and thousands of dams throughout the country. Pretty much every flowing stream has been dammed up. And all of those dams are now coming of age. Every structure that you ever build, all the concrete and everything, has a limited lifespan. And with sedimentation filling those reservoirs, this is a problem around the country. You might have heard of the Oroville Dam that almost failed a couple of years ago. I think that was a real wake-up call statewide in terms of these dams that are in need of repair or removal to fix our waterways. So I think the next... Peter, would you like to cover this section?
So I started working on Matilija Dam in 2005. Just pales in comparison to how long Paul's been involved, but I have been involved for quite a while, and so I'll share a few things about how the project's gone since I've been involved. So before I got involved, actually, in 1998, a few stakeholders that wanted to see the dam removed contacted members of the Board of Supervisors and asked them to direct the then flood control district to look at alternatives to removing the dam. And so we began to work on it. And one of the first efforts that we did was working with the U.S. Bureau of Reclamation on the appraisal report, which you see in back of me. That was followed by a feasibility study that the Corps of Engineers completed. It was felt, in those days, it was felt that the Corps of Engineers had the appropriations and funding that would be needed to build this kind of project. And we went through and laid out a lot of what I'll describe here in the next couple slides. And so in 2004, when feasibility was completed, we also had completed an EIS for the project. And this is what the project looked like. It was a $145 million project. It was made up of many components, some of which are same as the ones that we are moving ahead with currently. One thing to note is we did look at this $145 million, just to give you a context, in 2017 dollars, and it increased to about $206 million. So I know all of you know about inflation, the value of time. It's the same in construction and projects. The longer this project takes, the more expensive it will be. So one of the components of the project, the alternative that was chosen during that incarnation of the project was an alternative called 4B. And what that consisted of was taking all of the fine organic-laden sediment that was right upstream of the dam and putting it in a slurry pipeline and slurrying that down below the Casitas-Robles diversion. The most difficult part of this project, as anybody will tell you that's been working on it, is how to remove the dam in a way that doesn't or minimizes the effect on the water supply in the Ojai Valley. So this project looked at a number of different disposal sites, and as the Corps of Engineers moved forward with the project design, as happens in project design, the cost of this slurrying operation doubled in price. And that got everybody very concerned, both at the Corps and us as locals, of, well, how are we going to accommodate this increase in costs? So then they began to look at alternative disposal sites. And one of the ideas that came up was the idea of storing the material where it more or less exists now, within the reservoir area. That alternative was called upstream storage area, and unfortunately, in order to leave it there, because all that the fines that had all the organic sediment was felt like it needed to be held there permanently, that there would need to be a permanent protection of that stockpile, and that consisted of what they call soil cement, which essentially is a mixture of sand and cement to protect that. And at that point, the stakeholders for the project had a lot of concerns, and they expressed them in a way that they really began to withdraw support for the project in moving in that direction. And so at that point, we began a process. There was a fine sediment study group formed back in 2010, and that talked about, well, what should we do? How can we move this forward? What other initial studies could we do to move the project forward? At that point, the Corps sort of pulled back a little bit, and we haven't seen any federal appropriations since 2009. But that after that fine sediment study group was formed, we formed a technical advisory committee, and that developed a scope of work that then was funded by the California Coastal Conservancy to do some additional analysis in the watershed, and that began in 2014. So I'll describe now what came out of those studies that occurred between 2014 and 2016. There were 6 initial options looked at. Those were then narrowed down to 3, and the one that was chosen unanimously by consensus was this alternative here. And you might have heard about it. It's uncontrolled orifices with optional gates. And what this is what we would do is pre-drill 2 12-foot diameter holes into the dam. We would leave the upstream-most few feet of the dam in place, so the dam there's not a hole all the way to the upstream end of the dam, and then we would wait. We wait for an event that would be able to flush the fine sediment out to the ocean. So the sediment that's just upstream of the dam, that fine sediment, is probably a couple million cubic yards of fine sediment that has a mixture of silts and clays and some organic material. That's the material that we have to get past Robles. And so we did quite a bit of analysis of this alternative. We had a consultant take a look at what the impacts of the alternative would be. Here's a project here, the conduit dam removal. It was removed in a very similar manner, where all the fines were flushed through the dam. And so one of the things about this concept is that projects like the conduit dam in 2011 wasn't known back in 2004. So some proof of concept projects occurred in the intervening years that we didn't have the benefit of knowing about. So the process of that erosion of the fine sediment would look something like this. There would be the low point, or the thaw wag of the river behind the dam, we believe is still there. And as that fine sediment begins to flush through, we believe that it will find that original low point in the river. And over a few days to a few weeks, we essentially would get all the way back down to the original bed elevation. Now, some of the sediment that's behind the dam now would stay there. Right now it's super saturated. It's sitting in water like a bathtub. But when the orifices are opened and the sediment flushes through, all that sediment that doesn't get flushed out will begin to drain and will then be restored with native vegetation. So here's some examples of the concern of how long it would take for the sediment that would be in the water column to dissipate. So you can see 2 examples. The conduit dam, it took about a week for that turbidity to come back down, and the Marmot dam, which is actually more similar in some ways than the conduit dam, more sand and gravel delta deposit, would take on the order of 12 hours for that sediment increase to come back down. Now, what we need to wait for is a good storm to flush that fine sediment. And our consultants, Stillwater Sciences and AECOM, have determined that it's about what we call 1,700 cubic feet per second average daily flow event. So it would be, if you know the definition of cubic foot per second, so cubic foot is like a basketball. So if you threw a basketball past you in a second, that would be 1 cubic foot per second. Well, we're looking at 1,700 cubic foot per second averaged over the whole day. So it would be an event that would last the whole day, and it would have a peak of probably around 3,000 to 3,500 CFS. And those events don't come every year. So on average, they come about every 3 to 4 years, but it's not precise. In some years, we can have that event come in subsequent years, and in some cases, every 2 years, every 3 years, every 4 years. It's even taken as long as 6 years between those events. So it would be a medium-sized event, not a large event like a 69, but 1969 event. But it would be after we're ready to remove the dam, and we cut out those two orifices. It could take a few years of waiting for that storm to flush that fine sediment. So one of the things that our consultant looked at was the impact to the roadless diversion, because what they determined was that we would miss one storm event. Casitas would not be able to divert during one storm event. And Casitas gets about 30% of their water from roadless diversion. About 70% of the water comes from either the watershed that drains to it, Santa Ana and Coyote watersheds drain directly into Casitas, or the water that falls directly on the lake. But that 30% is very critical. And one of the analysis that we showed is without roadless and the current customer base that Casitas has, that lake would go dry. So roadless is an important element of Casitas' portfolio. So what we found out was that that one storm would lose about 4 to 6% of the reservoir capacity diversion. So that 4 to 6% would be carried through until the reservoir filled back up again, and then that impact would be gone completely. So what was determined was that it's likely that we would have to go through a series of wet years in order to fill that reservoir back up again. And as all of you know that live in the valley, Casitas being low, that it nearly spilled in 2005, but it's been coming down ever since then, and that's because we've been in a fairly dry period since 2005. There's no doubt in my mind that when we go back into a wet period again, that reservoir will fill back up, but we need that to happen. So in the case of this project, that 4 to 6% of the reservoir capacity would be lost until we went into a wet period again. So because of that, we did do some studies on the water supply mitigations, and what that means is what could we do to mitigate that impact to the water supply. And so we looked at 23 different options, and they consisted of diversion replacement supplies, reuse and conservation, and then treatment alternatives. So we've looked at all those issues. We're just getting ready now to begin to do more work in this regard, which we'll talk about later in the project meeting. So after all this work was done, in March of 2016, we met with the project stakeholders, a group that we used to call the Design Oversight Group, and we presented all three of these alternatives. What we presented was that one of the alternatives, which I didn't describe, was much closer to the Corps of Engineers alternative and might have an easier time getting approved by the Corps. The alternative ultimately that they did choose, which I described, is not like the Corps as alternative, and we would have had to basically go back to the beginning of the project with the Corps if that alternative were chosen. That's the alternative that was chosen, and there was a lot of discussion about if we pick the right alternative, we'll be able to find funding. Of course, representing the owner of the dam, the Watershed Protection District, the questions that came to mind were, how? How are we going to be able to come up with the money to remove the dam? So during that meeting, we essentially created a funding committee, and Hans Cole was gracious enough to accept the job of facilitating that group, and has done a great job since he's been involved. And with our mission was basically to develop a funding plan, obtain great grant funding, and guide the project team along the line. There's been a lot of great work in that regard. I won't belabor that now because there's more meeting to go. But out of that funding committee in 2016 is kind of how we've gotten to where we are now. And that's a video from a couple of years ago, or maybe a year ago. We had a nice flow event. So I think now I'm turning over to Hans to talk about the funding committee and the funding plan.